Okay, everybody. Well, welcome. I can see that the number of participants is beginning to plateau, so we are got a lot to get through today, so we'll begin. So, good afternoon and welcome to the second in our series of webinars for those new to or returning to HESES. My name is Roger Lear and I'm a funding officer at the Office for Students, the OFS. This session today is about the different ways in which we classify student numbers in the HESES return. So as usual, let's first do a little bit of housekeeping. So if my link goes down, my colleague Will Alwood will step in to take over from me, and my colleague Graham Price will join us later on to respond to your questions. We've turned on the live transcription feature in Zoom, so captions are available by clicking on the CC icon. Unfortunately, the jargon we use might scramble a few of the words. I'm sorry about that, but if you're not clear on anything, do please just ask us. The event is being recorded, and in a day or two that will be on our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to find the link to the recording via the event pages of our website, and I'll show you a link for that in a moment or two. The intended audience for this session, and in fact all of the rest of the sessions this month, is very much those that have not really come across HESES before, or perhaps they want a refresher because they're returning to it at any time during this session. You can submit questions for us to answer. We'll pause a few times to answer these as we go. And then we should have more time at the end for questions as well. I should also at this point thank those of you who have submitted questions before the event. We'll work those in as we go. So to do this, please use, to submit questions, please use the Q&A feature of Zoom rather than the chat feature. That should only be used if for any reason you need to get in touch with our events team. Now we're scheduled to go for 90 minutes today. If we can finish early, then we will do, but it's a very, very meaty session this, so it might go that long. We will be sending an email to those who have agreed to fill out an evaluation form on their experience in the webinars, but you don't have to wait for that. If you've got something you particularly want to tell us about what you've seen or heard here today or in any of these sessions, then I'll give you an email address in a moment which you can use for that. So let's take a look at where this session fits into our training program. Last week, we had a session for those that already have some knowledge and experience of HESES. You can watch that back if you think it will be useful to you. I'll give you the link shortly, but that session was called Essential Updates for Experienced Staff, and a recording, as I say, is available. Now, as I just said, we're now into the series for those that are new to HESES or returning to it. And so we had the first of those sessions on Tuesday, which we call the Introduction to OFS Funding and HESES24. If it's not there already, our events page will have the link to the recording very shortly, or you may be able to find it from our YouTube channel. Next, we have this presentation, categorizing your students using the HESES24 definitions. And on Tuesday next week, the 24th, we have identifying and counting students to be included in HESES24. And then a week today, the last of these sessions, which is called Getting HESES24 Signed Off and Multiplication Factors. So to sign up for those webinars still to come, or to view the recordings when they're available of any of these, please have a look at our events page, www.officeforstudents.org.uk/events. And as some of you may have heard me say before, I will read all these links and email addresses because I know some people rely purely on the audio for these sessions. So let's talk about the supporting materials that we have. We'll touch on some of these as we go through the session, but I'll also highlight the major resources here, and then we'll revisit all of those before we finish. So for an overview of OFS funding, please see our guide to funding. I won't actually read this long address here, but if you want to find that, go to our website, officeforstudents.org.uk, and search for OFS 2024.35, which is its publication number, or you can just search Guide to Funding. The best place to start for HESES resources is the main HESES page on our website. So that's at officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES, HESES. And I always advocate people sign up to our email alert service, which is a good sort of backstop. If you've missed something on one of those pages, officefordstudents.org.uk, sign up for email alerts with everything being hyphenated there. And there'll be things coming through there regularly, not just funding things, but all sorts of other useful information about the OFS and its activities. So I think we can now look at what we're going to cover today. So we'll take a brief look at the HESES24 workbook. I say a brief look because we will see more of it as we go in this and the next webinar. Then we need to consider what we call the HESES24 population. But most of this session is going to be on how to categorize students. And I'll put up a list here. We do this according to mode of study, level of study, length of the year that they're on, price group, fundability status, domicile, and whether or not they are new entrants. And I know that we had various questions submitted prior to the event about a lot of that. So hopefully I'll go a long way to answering those. Finally, we will touch on multiplication factors, which is something that we introduced last year as a separate process after HESES23, but this year we're incorporating it into HESES24. So this will be just a brief look because my colleague Will is going to do more on this subject in our final webinar next week. So let's start by looking at the first of these, the HESES24 workbook. This is where all the numbers go. And just so we know what we're talking about here, this is the information sheet in the workbook itself. It's the first sheet. What you will see there will be customized for each separate provider. We'll look at some of the other sheets as we go today, but first, let's ask a question. What does the HESES workbook actually do? What's it for? Well, the idea is that it gives an early indication of the number of higher education students studying in the academic year 2024-25 at your provider. It does this by categorizing students, and we'll look into all the ways of doing that today, and then counting them in those different categories. And that's really where we're focusing for the next webinar. So this brings us on to consider what's referred to as the HESES population. And before we look at this closely, let's talk about the unit of measure that we use. Another way of looking at this is to ask the question, what is recorded in HESES? Well, HESES counts what we call years of engagement, and we use the abbreviation YOE there. This in turn kind of begs the question, what do we mean by an engagement? Well, an engagement is a student's commitment to an educational aim, be that a qualification or credit, and its realization over time. And so an engagement is made up of one or more years of engagement. Our next webinar will go into more detail on how we define and count years of engagement. A brief note here to say that before HESES23, we used to use the term years of instance. And if you've encountered HESES before, or you speak to colleagues that have done so, or that may be a familiar term, and you may see it in older workbooks and documentation. There are some differences in the definition between the two, and we can go into those with you if the need arises. So we now need to work out who should be included in HESES24. And to do that, we'll use this diagram, and we'll take it from the top down, where we have all the students associated with a provider. Now, of these, some, in fact, for most providers, probably most of them, will be of interest. But you can imagine that we may not want to include some of them. For example, for further education colleges that also teach higher education courses, we don't count their further education students because HESES is only about higher education activity. So looking at the second level there, we can see that Annexes A and B of the HESES guidance define the HESES population, and the criteria are summarized on the next slide. I should say I'll refer a lot to the HESES guidance here. You can find that off the main HESES page, which I cited earlier. It is available now, so you can go and look at that, but that's going to be something which is extremely useful as you go through the preparation process. So as I say, Annexes A and B define the HESES population, and let's have a look at the criteria that specifies. Annex A says that students must be aiming for a recognized higher education qualification or higher education level credit that can be counted towards one. We'll come back to this concept in a moment. Students must be registered with the provider and actively pursuing studies in the 2024-25 academic year. We're also going to come back to this idea of being registered on one of the next few slides. And they must be spending no more than half the active study time for their whole engagement outside the UK. There are some minor caveats for this for students in particular circumstances. Annex A has all the details. A couple of things to note here. Something that occasionally confuses newcomers to HESES is that it captures all students on a countable year of engagement, not just those in their first year. And it's worth saying it's possible for one student to generate more than 1 year of engagement, although this is rare and limitations may apply. So again, have a look at the HESES guidance, and if you need help with that, refer it to us. I said that we go back to discuss what we mean by recognised higher education for OFS funding purposes. So for this, we turn to the HESES guidance again, where we find the definition that we use in Annex B. This derives from the Higher Education and Research Act of 2017, which is known as HERA, which we talked about in our introductory presentation. Now, I won't read this in the top half there, or this in the bottom half, because these are two very wordy pieces of text that both cite the Education and Student Support Regulations 2011 and the Education Reform Act of 1988, but mainly because they are also in the HESES guidance document in Annex B. But we've included the text here to emphasise that the courses included in the HESES population are defined with reference to legislation. So this will largely include most degree qualifications, your bachelor's and master's degrees and so on, other postgraduate qualifications, foundation degrees, and things like HNCs and HNDs. Some other qualifications, such as certain professional qualifications, are not included. Now, if you're not sure about this, you can contact the funding team for help. And then in this context, there's one thing to note for those providers offering higher technical qualifications, HTQs. The definition we just looked at included some higher technical qualification courses from 2023-24. So we now collect data on these because we have additional funding for eligible HTQ courses. We'll see how we do this when we look at Table 5 in the HESES workbook later on. Notice, though, that being an HTQ is not sufficient on its own to be included in Table 5. Only those approved by the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education, IFATE, may be eligible if they meet the Annex B criteria that we've just discussed. So see the Completing the HESES24 workbook publication for more on this. This will be released alongside the HESES workbooks in late October, so you can't look at it now. But when it is released, if you go to the HESES page, officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES, you'll find it under the heading Supporting Documents. Returning to the original diagram, which I showed, the hierarchical diagram, we've just been at the second level there exploring the definition of the HESES population, and we established that it's those aiming for a recognised higher education qualification or for credit, registered with a provider and actively studying in 24-25 and spending no more than half the active study for their whole engagement outside the UK. But even this may include some years of engagement that we don't want to encounter. So moving down to the highlighted box in the bottom left, we now need to work out what to include on the HESES24 survey, and this is defined in Annex C, where you will find 3 criteria. I'll run through them briefly, and I won't dwell on these because we will be talking a lot more about the actual counting of years of engagement in this and the next, particularly the next webinar. But briefly, to be counted, years of engagement for 24-25 must meet all of these criteria. A fee must be charged. Annex C will have more details. The student must not be writing up a thesis, for example, or a dissertation throughout the entire year. And a student must not have been withdrawn, or has not been forecast withdrawn within 2 weeks of starting their engagement. There'll be more about this, as I say, in terms of how to count years of engagement in the next webinar. And I should say at this point, I've mentioned Annex C a couple of times here. If you look at the guidance document, there are actually 2 versions of that, C1 and C2. The first is for those at further education and sixth form colleges and academies, and everybody else looks at C2. So before we go on, I want to backtrack briefly to one of the previous slides, and it's the one that dealt with who we include in the HESES population. And I've highlighted here the bullet in question, we said students must be registered with a provider and actively pursuing studies in the 2024-25 academic year. So the question is, what do we mean by registered? We can say that students should only be returned in HESES24 by the provider that they are registered with. So this is the provider which has the full contractual responsibility to the student for the provision of educational services. In other words, the registering provider is the one that has tuition fees paid to them, which usually comes from the student loan company. And for students on apprenticeships, this is the same as the lead provider for the Education and Skills Funding Agency, the ESFA. That is the provider that receives the apprenticeship funding from the ESFA. And we'll come on to say a little bit more about apprenticeships in a moment. Further guidance on this, of course, including details on joint courses and exchange students, is in Annex A. So connected with this idea of registration is the concept of validation and of subcontracting. So where providers are in partnership, this could be a validation arrangement where awards are made by the provider and they're validated by another provider that has degree awarding powers, hence the name. Students are registered with the teaching provider and they will report those students in their data returns. Subcontractual, or sometimes known as franchise arrangements, are different though. Students here are not registered by the teaching provider. They're doing the teaching on behalf of the registering provider. That is to say, the teaching is being subcontracted to them. And in which case, therefore, the teaching provider does not report students in their data returns. Again, more on this in Annex A of the HESES guidance. Continuing these thoughts about registration, let's take the chance to make a few points about apprenticeship, because some students may be taking their higher education qualification as part of an apprenticeship. For HESES, they should be registered with and reported by the lead provider. Again, that's the one usually contracted by the ESFA. For apprenticeships, we only fund activity related to the higher education course, so only activity that directly contributes to their recognised higher education qualification should be counted towards their activity that's reported in HESES. That activity is what determines a student's mode of study, part-time, full-time, which we'll talk about in a few moments. And we do not expect this to include all of the apprentice's time in the workplace. So again, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but apprenticeship programs are sometimes tied to employees of a particular company, which ordinarily might make them what we would call a closed course, which would then make them non-fundable, as we'll see later. But because they're apprenticeships, we do not treat them as closed courses. The bottom line here is that apprenticeship students are reported in HESES in the same way as any other student, although it's worth making the point that if you or any of your colleagues were involved with HESES22, you may remember that we collected additional data on degree apprenticeships. That funding is being made now through a different mechanism since 23-24, so we don't collect that data anymore. Okay, quite a big chunk to start with, so I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Graham Price to see if we've had any questions come through. Remember that you can submit questions to us at any time during this session using the Q&A function of Zoom. Please reserve the chat for any necessary queries to the event support team. So Graham, are you there?
I am indeed. We have had a couple of questions come in, and we have obviously had some pre-submitted questions. There were a few pre-submitted questions just asking about general aspects of HESES24 or the concepts or about categorizing. So at this stage, hopefully these will be covered by today's webinar, but obviously where any questions come up on the particular topics in each session of this webinar, feel free to keep adding questions into the Q&A. And obviously if at the end of it, the question hasn't been answered, the email addresses that Roger has shared on the slides, feel free to email us in and hopefully we can either address them or confirm if they're going to be covered in the upcoming webinars. Another question we did have, we had one about higher apprenticeships. These are going to be covered in the upcoming section of the webinar. So there'll be more on that. Again, long courses, that comes in one of the later sessions today. And a couple more. We've had questions about new entrants and HTQs. They're covered in the last section of today's webinar. As well as for HTQs, there's a bit more in Tuesday's webinar. So if you're interested in more information about that and haven't yet, sign up to Tuesday's webinar. And the last of the pre-submitted questions we had was asking about common issues and errors that providers encounter. In terms of that, the OFS, we're not best placed to address that because obviously we only see things once they come to us. So it may be that providers have had particular issues preparing the return or other things. So as usual, we recommend getting in touch with sector colleagues or contact at sector bodies to open up a discussion about that if you need any further support, or if needed, if there are any particular questions you're having about the return as you're doing it, the email addresses again. The team's here to help, and hopefully we can help resolve any issues. Now, onto the questions we've had so far. One question we had was about whether or not NCFE diplomas at level 4 or 5 are included. These qualifications are not included as eligible for HESES because those qualifications are ones that are leading to a qualification in the Register of Regulated Qualifications, which is one of the exclusions listed in Annex B. That's covered in paragraph 1B, which lists what's in and what's not. So unfortunately, those ones aren't in. If you're not sure about qualifications, check out Annex B. There is a link in there which will take you direct to the register that you can check. And we've had another one, which will probably be more covered in the upcoming session on Tuesday, about whether or not students joining in January 25 are eligible to be counted. They would be column 2 students. So obviously you consider them that they will be coming and be registered when they join you in January. It's not just students that are registered with you when you complete the return. Obviously, if you have any students joining you in January who you are teaching on behalf of another provider who they are registered with, then those students would not be included. And that's all the ones we have for now. I will prepare the next set of questions, the next Q&A. So back to you for now, Roger.
Okay, thank you, Graham. And I should say that with the questions that we get, very often we get similar questions. So Graham and his colleagues are sort of curating and collating those. So even if you don't hear the exact words you've typed in or sent in being spoken in a question, it doesn't necessarily mean we've forgotten. It might be that it's just been merged with something else. But if you do think we've missed something or we've got hold of the wrong end of the stick in terms of what you're asking, then do please write to us and we'll try to make sure that you get the answer that you need. So thank you for all of the questions. So now, though, let's go back to our slides. So now we know exactly who we should count in the HESES workbook and what unit of measure we're using, the year of engagement. So now we can start to look more closely at the workbook and how we use it to put those numbers into the different categories that we need. So in this section, we'll start by looking at these categories: mode of study, price group, length of year, and level. And at the highest level, we categorize by mode of study. So we will start with that. In the HESES workbook, you will see separate tables for each mode of study circled here. As to the other courses, you can see here, the courses table is for further education and sixth form colleges and academies only. If you're not one of those, you won't see that in your workbook. We will talk about that, though, briefly today and in the next webinar particularly. So the other tables are analyzing the data in tables 1, 2, and 3 in different ways, and we will come to them either later today or in the next webinar. So now let's talk about precisely what we mean by the mode of study. So the mode in which students study determines which table they are recorded on in the HESES workbook. Now this can be full-time, it's got on table 1, sandwich year out, they go on table 2, and part-time go on table 3. These modes are mutually exclusive, and Annex D is the place to refer to in the HESES guidance to get chapter and verse. Just to reiterate what I was just saying, this little chart on the right here shows the other tables in the workbook for completeness, and as just noted, they analyze student data in different ways, and we'll come on to what they do shortly. And another reminder that the courses table will only appear in further education colleges workbooks. So let's look at full-time. Table 1 records full-time student activity, so the criteria for that are, first, that full-time fees are charged. Second, that I should say, in terms of full-time fees, they can be waived, but there are restrictions on this, and again, Annex D is a place to go. Second, students are normally required to attend a named location for at least 24 weeks in the year of engagement. Now, I've highlighted and lent on that word attend because that's what it means here. It means to actually show up in person. And this could be at a provider themselves or somewhere else, for example, a subcontracted location. And as such, this means that distance learning for HESES purposes is not recorded as full-time. Finally, students must undertake study, tuition, learning in the workplace, work placement for an average of at least 21 hours per week. Now, this can include time spent on a sandwich work placement if the year doesn't meet the criteria to be a sandwich year out. So we'll see how this works shortly. So let's look at the next mode, which is sandwich year out. So table 2 records this, and again, Annex D has full details. Following on from the last slide's mention of work placement, a year of engagement is counted as a sandwich year out if it includes a period of work-based experience and it meets these criteria. A reduced fee is chargeable. Year of engagement meets the definition given in the student support regulations, or is an Erasmus scheme year abroad spent working, which is the terminology which is used there. And it must also meet the time-based criteria in Annex D. These are that no more than 10 weeks, there should be no more than 10 weeks of full-time study, or the total of all the time spent not in full-time study on things like work placement is not more than 30 weeks. So there are examples in Annex D, and we should look at one now. So in this example, in year 1, students have 15 weeks of full-time study and a 16-week work placement. Now, this year should be recorded as full-time because full-time fees are chargeable. There's a requirement to attend for at least 24 weeks, and there's study, tuition, learning in the workplace, work placement for at least 21 hours a week. Now, notice that in this example, the study and the work placement together are the thing which take the activity over the 24-week threshold. This goes back to the part of our full-time definition when we said that full-time study can include time spent on sandwich work placement if the year doesn't meet the criteria to be a sandwich year out, and this year doesn't, so it's full-time. So in year 2, assuming all the other sandwich year out criteria that we just talked about are met, we need to look again at the periods of study and work placement. So we have 15 weeks of full-time study and a 16-week placement. This would count as a sandwich year out because the total time so far not in full-time study is greater than 30 weeks. You've got your 2 16-week placements, which make 32 weeks. There are other examples in Annex D. If you're not sure, again, come to us and ask. Finally, we come to part-time. If a year doesn't meet the definitions for full-time or sandwich year out, then for HESES purposes, it's considered to be part-time. So it's worth mentioning here that mode can change between years, and this often involves part-time study. And again, Annex D is a place to look at for details and examples. Occasionally, there are scenarios where the HESES definition of mode of study is an issue when compared with the corresponding individualized data return. So this might happen, for example, when a student can be studying at a full-time rate, but not meet the HESES definition of full-time that we just talked about. So for example, a student studying on perhaps a 15-month full-time course, where in their second year of engagement, in other words, the last 3 months of that, they would be still studying at a full-time intensity, in other words, for more than 21 hours a week. but they would be attending for less than the 24-week threshold needed as part of that full-time definition. So in this case, this would make them part-time for HESES purposes, but full-time in terms of the relevant individualized data return. So to get around that, we suggest that if you're submitting the ILR, the individualized learner record, to the ESFA, you should use mode stud equals 3. And if you're using the student record, the data futures record, use SCS mode of 02, which is other full-time. And this will allow these students to be recorded correctly. Again, refer to additional guidance on mode of study section in Annex D of the HESES guidance. At this point, it's worth just mentioning apprenticeship students again. So as discussed earlier, some higher education students may be apprentices. It's important to remember that only the activity that directly contributes to their recognized higher education qualification should be counted towards a student's study. In other words, generally, we would normally expect them to be part-time, although occasionally there might be exceptions. There are further criteria that must be satisfied for that. And again, Annex D is a place to go for guidance on that. Right. Once more, that's quite a lot on mode of study. So let's just check in again with Graham and see what he's got for us.
Just accessing the video there. We've had a few more questions come in. One question we've had so far regarding the aspect of a fee must be charged, and obviously where a student may be taking longer to complete, they may not have a fee. We do have a bit in the HESES guidance, Annex C1, paragraph 10A, or Annex C2, paragraph 16A, which covers this, which reflects that in some cases, a fee may not be charged in the current year because a fee for the activity has already been paid in the previous year. This should not be treated as a fee waiver. Rather, the student should be treated as having been charged a fee for the year. This obviously is particularly where students may not have completed some modules, or they may need to repeat them, and they're doing that in a subsequent year. So obviously, in those students can still be considered as having had a fee charged. We've had a question about what is the definition of full-time. Obviously, in general, there is the legal definition of what they can be up to, but predominantly providers themselves, yourselves out there, will define the levels of what you will charge for a full-time course and what you will charge for a part-time course, and that is obviously what we're considering there, because obviously full-time courses are normally charged at a higher level than the part-time courses. We've had a question about would sandwich apply to apprentices? I would, in generally, I would say no, because I don't think any apprenticeship courses can meet the definition of what is considered a sandwich. There is a definition in the legislation as to what is a sandwich, which is essentially a course that begins and ends with a period of full-time study, and then there is some placement in the middle, and there is a reduced fee charged for the year for the placement. And obviously, with apprenticeships, with the placement activity taking place throughout the course, it's unlikely to meet the particular definition. But obviously, it's worth checking the course that you may have against the legislation on that one, and whether or not it meets the definition. And finally, at this time, we have had a question about, we have previously made available on our website a learning aims sheet about what is considered included or excluded from HESES based on learning aims. Will there be one this year? I can confirm that we are planning to. Normally we do release one in September, which we then update in October. But that this year, with what's going on with the learning aims and some updating that we're doing, we're planning to just do the one release in October, which will hopefully include all the updates to to what's been going on with the learning aims. And obviously we'll be making this available ahead of when we release the workbooks out to you later in October. Okay, so that's all the questions I've got for now. And obviously I'll be back again later to pick up some more in the next round of Q&A.
Okay, Graham, thanks for all of that. Very good. So let's press on. But before we do, we'll just recap briefly in terms of how we categorize students. We have been looking at the highest level, where we have separate tables in the workbook for each mode of study: full-time, table 1, sandwich year out on table 2, and part-time on table 3. And now within each of those tables, we further categorize students by these attributes: price group, length of year, level of study, and fundability status. When we get to table 5, we'll add domicile to that list. So before we look at what these all mean, let's just take a big picture view of one of the workbook tables to see where things fit. So this is an example of table 1, which would be for full-time students, as just explained. So the equivalent tables for sandwich year out students in table 2 and part-time table 3 look much the same. These tables are structured in a way where you've got the headings across the top here, and we'll be discussing each of these in the following slides. You can see most of the categories I mentioned on the last slide, and note the annex in the HESES guidance, which deals with each of those. So you've got price group, length, level, and fundability status. Domicile, as I say, we get to in table 5, which we'll look at later. This stage, I just want to mention the groupings of worksheet columns that you can see. These are labeled column 1, column 2, and column 1+2 on the right. We will talk about these in the next webinar, but I just want you to see them here and to say that you will enter student numbers into the first 2 of these according to the classifications we're going to look at now. Which one to use depends on when the student's year of engagement begins, and we'll discuss that in the next chapter. But that goes to the question which Graham had about students starting in January 2025, so they would probably go in column 2. But I won't steal Will's thunder for the next webinar. I'll let him explain that in more detail then. The third column there, column 1+2, is calculated automatically, which is why it's in blue. So you won't be able to enter details in there because that's done for you. Let's zoom in then on the first of these, where we can look at price groups. So years of engagement are assigned to one of 6 price groups that reflect the costs associated with particular subjects. So in price group A, we've got the clinical years of medical, dental, and veterinary courses. Price group B is largely laboratory-based subjects, and I've just given a few examples here: chemistry, engineering, and certain healthcare courses. Price group C is split into various parts. C1.1 is for strategically important intermediate cost subjects, and again, there's some pre-registration courses here for things like nursing, and it includes computing, information technology, and other things like archaeology. And then we've got C1.2, which is for other intermediate cost subjects covering provision in things like performing arts, creative arts, and media studies, that type of thing. Price group C2 is for other subjects with a laboratory, a studio, or fieldwork element of some kind, and this might include things like geography, languages, psychology, as you can see here. And that leaves price group D, largely classroom-based subjects. Again, I've got a few examples there, but you get the idea. And these are used in calculating grants for various funding allocations. So how are courses assigned to these price groups? One of 2 ways: either by what we call specific cases, or according to a coding system, which is the higher education classification of subjects. Now, this is now used by all providers. Further education colleges used to use the Learn Direct classification system, LDCS, and this is a recent change made by the ESFA. So there are details of this in Annex G of the guidance. These groupings are important because we want to get an accurate representation of your higher education provision in order to provide the correct funding. So looking at these is something that may come up in the data verification that we do for HESES. We'll come back to the HECOS coding system in a moment, but first let's look at the specific cases. So here we are, the specific cases where certain price groups allocations are predefined. So these are sandwich years out. We've got the clinical years of medical, dental, and veterinary science courses, certain pre-registration courses in nursing, midwifery, and allied healthcare, and it's social work, and initial teacher training. Full details, again, Annex G of the guidance. If a course does not fall into one of these categories, the price group is determined by reference to the HECOS codes that we just mentioned. So following the recent announcement by the ESFA, that means that all providers now use HECOS codes, although there is still a slight difference for further education colleges in HESES terms, at least, which we will come to in a couple of slides. First, though, let's make a few points about HECOS. HECOS is a way of classifying areas of study for use in data surveys. Sorry, I should say that HECOS codes are administered by the Higher Education Statistics Agency, HESA, which is now part of JISC, and the web address here that I put, this is actually a bit of a cheat, this address, because if you use it, it redirects to a much longer URL. So it's a slight cheat here. It's long enough. It's hesa.ac, that's hesa.ac.uk/support/documentation/HECOS, HECOS. There you can find tables that will show the complete list of HECOS codes. And these, we map these onto the price groups which are used in HESIS. Now, a detailed mapping of HECOS codes to price groups is available in Annex A of what we called our changes, we colloquially call our changes document for 22-23. This is an older document, but it's still current. It's got rather a long URL again. So the best way of accessing it is to go to our website at officeofstudents.org.uk and search for its publication number, which I've put there, OFS 2021.32. So as noted, HESA has produced guidance for assigning HECOS codes to courses. That's the address, hesa.ac.uk/support/documentation/HECOS. And this says the qualification subject or subjects must represent directly or relate very closely to the wording on the qualification's official certificate of award. So more than 3 qualification subjects would generally be regarded as exceptional. Now, the last part of this quote suggests that, in fact, it's possible that there may be a split between different subjects in different price groups. And so we will look at that idea in a moment. But first, this is where we have that slight wrinkle I mentioned about further education colleges. And that is what we refer to as the courses table. This does some of the work for further education colleges. And only they will see the courses table in their workbook. So if you aren't working at a further education college, please bear with us for a very short while we just look at this briefly. HECOS codes are associated with each course's recorded learning aim reference. That was mentioned in one of the questions. And the courses table maps learning aim references to price groups using HECOS data. This goes to the question that Graham was answering about the details of that we publish. And we'll talk about that in the next webinar. You can also look up the learning aim references on the ESFA's FALAR search website. Another long URL, https:// and this is all hyphenated, submitlearnerdata.service.gov.uk/finder learning aim, with that last bit also being hyphenated. For new courses, please do make sure that you get a learning aim reference from the ESFA as soon as you can, and please let us know if there's going to be a delay on that. Now, to reiterate, I'm just introducing these ideas for further education colleges here, and we will explore them more in the next webinar, but there is more than allocating years of engagements to price groups using HECOS codes in Annex G of the HESIS guidance. So I'd recommend that you have a look at that. So let's return to the idea of a course's content falling under more than one price group. In other words, the idea of price group splits, which I mentioned a moment ago. This applies to all providers. If a course has elements that fall into more than one price group, years of engagement can be split between those price groups if it's associated with 2 or more HECOS codes. So the important principle here is that activity is split between price groups to reflect how much activity students do based on the course as a whole. i.e. each year would have the same split of price groups. So best illustrated, I think, by an example. In this degree, as you can see here, it's 2 subjects, physics and maths, and these are associated with 2 separate price groups. Physics maps to price group B and maths to price group C2. So here's a breakdown of how the course looks. The first year, it's 60% physics, 40% maths. That's reversed in the second year. And in the third year, 80% of the time is on physics and 20% is on maths. And if you average that out, it comes out at physics 60% and maths 40%. And all that means that all years of engagement, whether they be in the first, second, or third year, that get reported on HESES would be recorded using that 60-40 split. Okay, moving on. And referencing our workbook again, now we can look at length of course. Here, as you may see from the mauve shaded area, we're looking at long and standard years of engagement, and these are dealt with in Annex H. Now, I know this was a pre-submitted question, so I hope this answers that question. Length of year is recorded because it can feed into an element of teaching funding for accelerated full-time undergraduate provision or intensive postgraduate provision. So it's best to look at what a long year is, because everything that's not a long year is a standard year. So with long years for full-time students, where a student is in attendance for 45 weeks or more in the year of engagement. So some restrictions apply to that. Periods of work experience don't count, sandwiches out don't count, and usually foundation years, foundation degrees rather, don't count. Part-time students, well, it depends on the length of the equivalent full-time course. See Annex H for details. And if there isn't an equivalent full-time course, then speak to us and we'll be able to help you with that one. Standard length years is very simple. If it's not a long year, then it's a standard length year. So I hope that's answered the question that we had pre-submitted. Back to the workbook, let's look again at this. And now we're going to look at level of study. And for those that have been waiting, now is the time for our mandatory CAT picture. So we've got that out of the way. So for level of study, we define each of these in relation to the qualifications needed for entry to the course. So for undergraduate courses, no degree level entry requirement. For postgraduate taught courses, this is where the normal entry requirement is a degree level qualification. There are 3 separate sub-levels that we will need to look at in a moment. And then we have PGR, postgraduate research. The qualification aim here is a research-based degree, higher degree. And we'll look at that a bit in a moment. So starting with the undergraduate level, there's no degree level entry requirement for these, but in order to get the data that we need for the funding stream that we now have for level 4 and 5 courses, we have 2 sub-levels here, and which goes where is determined by the qualification aim of the course. So for undergraduate level 4 and 5, this is typically things like HNCs, high national certificates or diplomas or foundation degrees. And then UG Other is your typical bachelor's degree or top-up credit or credit without a qualification aim. So if a course has multiple qualification aims, which some do, check the guidance and or please talk to us. And you can find details in Annex E of the guidance. Okay, moving on, let's expand on what I said about postgraduate taught, where the normal entry requirement is a degree level qualification. There are, as I said, 3 sub-levels to this. First of all, there's PGT UG fee. And this is for students where they are designated under the undergraduate student support arrangement. So this only applies to a few different categories, students aiming for PGCE qualifications, some architecture, and pre-registration nursing, midwifery, and allied health profession courses. We then have PGT Master's Loan, students on a course that's eligible for Master's Loan. Now, I've lent on the word course there because this is a characteristic of the course rather than the student which determines this. And then we have PGT Other, which, as the name suggests, is everything which is not in the other 2 categories. And again, Annex E is a place to go to look at all of this in detail. So postgraduate research, you will find this in a few places in the workbook. It's not actually something we use for funding. It is though for planning. And again, Annex E is the place you need to look to find out more. Okay, before we push on to look at fundability status, let's see what's been coming in for the Q&A. So over to Graham.
Hello again. Yep, we have had a few more questions. The first one is referring back to where my colleague Roger previously talked about Erasmus and questioning what about Turing. This one's a particularly unusual one, but basically Turing courses are included, and this is down to the legal definitions here. Because obviously Erasmus is the legal term, and Erasmus covered what was Erasmus Plus, and then was expanded. The legal definition was expanded to include courses under the new Turing scheme as well. So obviously, you need to be careful when you're checking things against this. But basically, Erasmus is different from Erasmus Plus, but Erasmus includes both Erasmus Plus and Turing. We've also had a question about student course sessions that are full-time and where they go into the tables. This one's a question that will be covered as part of the counting session coming up on Tuesday. So I won't go into that too much today. Just recommend coming along to the session on Tuesday where that will be covered in full. Or obviously, if you're not able to, the presentation, the webinars will be available online afterwards. We've had a question about the transition to HECOS and when that will be available on FileArt, when that will be visible. At this time, it hasn't been confirmed to our team yet, although we have been in ongoing discussions with colleagues about that. But as far as we're aware, the codes are available in any downloads that you make from Lars. So it's worth, if you can't see it on FileR, to do a download, and you should be able to make the see the codes that are on there at the moment as part of that. We've had a question about courses where approval was still waited when the courses table was being completed, and whether or not temporary learning aims will be available. As with previous years, yes, there are. We do implement temporary learning aims. There are obviously two situations. One where a learning aim isn't yet on Lars, where it might still be going through the final stages of clearance with the ESFA. We do normally expect that such courses should be on Lars ahead of completion, because obviously learning aims should exist before students are recruited. But we understand that the ESFA obviously there can be delays in the process of getting the final clearance approved. And the other one is obviously where the information that exists around a learning aim is incorrect on Lars, and that obviously means that what is coming through in our courses table is incorrect because you're going through the process of correcting it. As with previous years, yes, we will still be issuing. There will be a certain amount of required information to confirm to us about those particular learning aims before we give out the codes, because we do log it, and we do expect that they should be replaced by the end of HESES. So we should have the confirmation that the information on Lars is correct, or that the learning aims on Lars are there. But yes, that process will be operating again this year. And finally, we've had a question about when the workbook will be out. That will be late October. At this stage, we haven't confirmed a specific date when it will be going out, but it will be no earlier than Monday the 28th or Tuesday the 29th of October. So very late in October, but similar to previous years. That's all the questions for this section now. But there will be more, so I'll see you again later for the next round of Q&A. Back to you, Roger.
Okay, Graham, thank you. So we are approaching the last lap now, and let's move on. So we're now going to look further at the remaining categories rather that we originally listed. So that starts with fundability status and domicile. We'll talk about new entrants and the other classifications, which we just saw a glimpse of at the beginning. So back to our example table 1 in the workbook, and let's look at the first item on that list, which is fundability status. Now, this is about separating out higher education activity at a provider that is fundable by the OFS from activity that isn't. And I'm showing this slide again so that we can keep track of where we are here. So we've been exploring the way to classify the students that we're counting in HESES24. That's those in the highlighted box there, bottom left. So we're now going to use that as the top level in the diagram that you can see here, because the HESES workbook splits the students to be counted into 2 broad groups. And we do this by looking at the fees that the students are entitled to pay. And as you can see on the second level here, we're looking at a split between those students that are entitled to pay home fees and those from overseas who are non-fundable from the OFS point of view. But this doesn't mean that all home fee students are fundable, hence the split that you can see on the bottom layer here. But we'll come to that shortly, because first we need to know exactly what we mean when we say home fee. Annex F in the guidance is a place where all of this is laid out. So this is where the fee regulations play a part. Annex F says that if a student is eligible under the student support regulations in HESES, they are home fee. But it's worth noting that periodically the regulations that Annex F refers to do change. So for example, from the 1st of August 2022, changes to legislation expanded the categories of students eligible for home fee status. Note also that these regulations may also include some EU students covered by the withdrawal arrangements. Further changes in recent years, which you can see in our changes document, most recently OFS 2024.37, the most recent of that, are explained there. But generally, you need to refer to Student Finance England regulations for full details, and you'll find links to all of that in Annex F. Okay, so moving on, we have others, which means overseas, and those falling outside the definition of home fee status. However, although we don't fund overseas students' activities, we still need to know about them on HESES. So again, Annex F is a place for all of this to be laid out, and it will refer you to the Education Fees and Awards England Regulations 2007, and that's not even its full title, as amended. But to make it clear, the point I'm labouring here is that the HESES guidance is not the definitive thing. You need to refer to the Student Finance England fee regulations, because that's where we take our definition from. So remember that we are deciding on whether student study activity is fundable by the OFS, and establishing whether they have home fee status is the first part of that. However, as we said earlier, not all home fee study activity is fundable, and so we need to work out what is and what is not. Basically, we can summarize things like this. Study activity is OFS fundable for home fee students unless they are in one of the non-fundable categories. So these are all in Annex F, and the main ones are shown here. So postgraduate research, initial teacher training leading to what they call qualified teacher status, QTS, or early years teacher status, and inset students, certain courses commissioned and funded by an NHS organisation, postgraduate taught students funded by another public source, students on closed courses, although you remember what I said earlier, that doesn't apply to students on apprenticeships. Students aiming for equivalent or lower qualifications, what's known as ELQs, unless they're exempt, and some health-related courses started before funding was transferred from DHSs. Probably not many of those around now. But the penultimate bullet there, the one about ELQ, is perhaps the most common. So let's talk about that a little bit more. ELQs, or more properly, equivalent or lower qualifications. This is when students are aiming for a qualification that is at the same level or lower than one they have already achieved. Generally, these are non-fundable, but there are some exemptions. Annex F has full lists, but examples here are those on foundation degrees or PGCEs, postgraduate certificates in education, students in receipt of disabled students' allowances, and a number of health-related courses. Generally, if you don't know a student's prior qualifications, you should treat them as aiming for an ELQ. So they will be non-fundable, they've got that unless exempt. Some things to note about ELQs. Students can be aiming for more than one qualification as part of the same course, for example, an HND and a degree. For ELQ purposes, you should assess status against the lower qualification. And one other thing, ELQ is a concept which is also used by some other organizations, but be wary of assuming that the definitions are the same. They're not always, so do be careful on that. Occasionally we get people that are getting caught out by that. Let's move on then to looking at, we're working our way towards looking at table 5, known as the planning table. And one of the fields on it is domicile, and it's convenient to examine it in terms of the hierarchy that we've just been looking at. And to do that, we've added another layer here. And as you can see, we only gather domicile data for home fee students. And we do this both for OFS fundable and non-fundable students. Domicile also crops up on the courses table for further education colleges, but we'll look at that in more detail in the next webinar. So let's take a first look at table 5 in the workbook to show how this structure fits there. Oops, sorry, my PowerPoint has just glitched there. That's it. So this is our first look at table 5, which I'm afraid is very wide, and it's divided into 3 sections. Now, domicile is used in both sections A and B. So I'm just going to zoom into the first of those for now, section A, because it's the same structure used in section A and section B. We'll take a closer look at the rest of the table in a few moments, but let's concentrate on section A for the time being. So at first glance of section A, we see that it conforms to the same pattern that we saw earlier in earlier tables. That is to say, we have columns 1 and 2, as we saw before. And again, we'll look exactly at what all of that means in terms of what they are in the next session. You can see that the structure in each of these is the same. So I'll just concentrate on column 1. Everything mentioned for that is true also for column 2 on the right. The other big difference between table 5 and the others that we've seen is that here, rather than being categorized by prize group and length of study, we only have groupings by mode and level. And for the first of those, we group full-time with sandwich year out as well. As before, you can see that we have split this between home fee and overseas. And within the home fee students, we have the split between OFS fundable and non-fundable. And now you can see that for each of these, we count those that are UK domiciled and others. So now that we can see where this data fits in the workbook, let's talk about exactly what we mean by domicile in the HESES return. So we use the definition from the corresponding individualized student data record. So for those returning the individualized learner record, the ILR, which will be the further education sixth form colleges, the domicile field is used. And the definition of that says that this is the country code of the student's permanent home address prior to entry to the course. It's not necessarily the correspondence address of the student. So for other providers, those that will be returning individualized student data to the designated data body under data futures, the corresponding field is perm add country. That's the name of the field in the student's entry profile entity, the country of the student's permanent home address on entry to their engagement. So that's what we mean when we talk about domicile in HESES. So before we continue, let me just reiterate that for HESES, domicile is only relevant for home fee students, and it's only used on table 5, and if you're a further education college, on the courses table. Before we take a look again at where domicile fits in section A, let's just say, in summarizing that, again, we're just looking at column 1 here in section A, and column 2 is the same. And as I've said, we're only concerned with home fee students, both OFS fundable and non-fundable. They can be UK domicile. In other words, those that are entitled to pay home fees and have their country of domicile as England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, or perhaps otherwise not specified in the UK, or others, the rest. Okay. So there we go. Sorry, slightly behind with the slides. There we go. So once again, let's have a large scale look at table 5. We spent some time looking at domicile. We use section A here as the model for this, but as we'll see in a moment, that structure is replicated in section B for what we call new entrants. And again, I know this was something that somebody was asking about. To the right, we have section C for higher technical qualifications, HTQs. The thing to remember when looking at the structure of table 5 is that section A represents the same numbers that we had in tables 1, 2, and 3, but they're just analyzed differently. And that both section B and C are subsets of section A. So let's look at section B and C. And to make it easier to see, I've cut out section A from this slide, but you can see that the structure remains the same as we saw in section A. So let's focus on section B. What goes here is a subset of section A, and a subset of new entrants. So how do we define these? Well, we use section B to categorize new entrants, and the student can be counted as a new entrant when they first generate a countable year of engagement, a countable year for that engagement, and when they have not been active at the same broad level at the provider in either of the 2 previous years. That is, I want to say same broad level, I'm talking about undergraduate, postgraduate talk, and postgraduate research. So this does not include students who are repeating a year, but it can include students entering directly onto the second or subsequent years of a course. So full details on this are available in Annex C of the guidance. And again, remember the C1 and C2 for further education colleges for C1 and everybody else C2. That leaves section C. So once again, this looks like section A, except that most rows, as you can see, are grayed out because the data we're collecting here is for higher technical qualifications, and these are all at level 4 and 5. So we'll talk more about these in the next webinar, but the important point to note here is that once again, this is a subset of section A. It's a different subset, but it's conceivable that a student could be in both of these subsets and therefore be recorded in both section B and C. However, let's talk about section C. We'll go into more details, as I say, next time on this, but as a point of reference, we can say that we're collecting this information to inform the additional funding that we will allocate to providers of this, of HTQ providers in the middle of 2024-25. To be eligible, an HTQ has to be approved by IFATE, the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education. A qualification may meet the requirements to be an HTQ, but if it's not approved by IFATE, it's not an HTQ in terms of what's reported, in terms of what is reported in HESES. So as I say, I'll be more on the next webinar about this, but again, you can always refer to section C of the guidance. Okay, just to complete the set, I'll mention the other tables that we've not really referred to yet and how to classify those student numbers. So first of all, we've got table 4, which is for years abroad. Now, obviously, this only applies to some providers. Generally, if you've got to grips with the others, it's fairly self-explanatory, especially once you've seen the next webinar on the role of column 1 and 2. There's plenty in the HESES guidance in Annex I for this. Perhaps slightly more common, I don't know, is tables 6A to 6C, which we refer to as the health tables, because these record students on courses in nursing, midwifery, and allied health professions. And we'll talk more about this next time as well. But briefly, we have full-time students in these categories in table 6A and part-time in table 6C. We used to have 6B for health students for sandwich years out, but as there aren't any, as far as we know, table 6B is no longer used, but we just retain the nomenclature. If you know differently, and if you think that there should be something which would go in a table 6B, then do please let us know. I think I mentioned this before, but if you're involved with HESES in previous years, or you look back at old HESES24 return, for example, you will see also that we used to have something called table 7, which was for gathering data on degree apprenticeship students. And this isn't needed anymore. Because our current funding model for degree apprenticeships doesn't use HESES data. So we took it out. Finally, as noted earlier on, the courses table is only in workbooks of further education, sixth form colleges and academies. So if you don't see it, if you're not one of those, don't panic. So now, briefly, I want to mention something new in this year's workbook, and this relates to what we call multiplication factors. These are what we use to translate the HESES data into the full-time equivalent figures that we use in calculating recurrent funding allocations. Now, I'm mentioning these here because you will see the worksheets included in the HESES workbook. You'll see them off to the right, as it were, of the workbook tabs. And I should say here that completing these is not mandatory, but I strongly recommend that you look at our webinar on the 26th in a week's time when we go into this subject in much more detail. It's called Getting HESES24 Signed Off and Multiplication Factors. And you can sign up for this or watch the recording at officeforstudents.org.uk/events. And there is a whole guidance document and everything as well, which we'll talk about in a week's time. So I think that has brought me to the end of my slides. So once again, it's time to go over to Graham and see what has come in on the Q&A. So this will probably be our last visit to Graham this time around. So if you've got anything which is not clear, then do please just stick it in the Q&A box, and Graham and his colleagues can look at it. So Graham, over to you.
Hello again. We have had a few more questions. The first one is around an ELQ question. And if a student completes a foundation degree and then goes on to do a degree top-up, should the ELQ remain the same as originally assessed for the foundation degree, or should it be assessed again? This would obviously depend on the circumstances for the student, but it should be checked again before they start the top-up, because obviously it depends on what the scenario was. It may be that the student was ELQ originally, and therefore, obviously, going on to the top-up, the student would now be considered ELQ, because for the foundation degree, they would have been exempt, so could be considered fundable. But once they have completed the foundation degree, then they become no longer exempt, so they would be ELQ for the degree. But where a student was previously not considered ELQ, before they start the top-up, it's worth checking their latest status, because it could be that they may have gained an additional qualification before they start the top-up, which potentially from another provider. It's rare, but it's worth checking whether or not they are still no longer ELQ, or whether they are now ELQ before the top-up. So that one, it is worth checking. We have had a question around returning the learner data and individualized data, and whether or not identifying them as non-exempt ELQ in that will make the learner not fundable. In terms of when it comes to the HESES recreation, our algorithms would pick up such students as non-fundable. But obviously, in terms of preparing the HESES return, you should already consider them that they will be that, and return them as non-fundable in the HESES24 workbook. And the final one we've had at this stage is a question around where a learner begins studying a foundation year, what's normally considered year zero, leading into a foundation degree, and whether or not they are a new entrant in year zero or year one. In terms of HESES, it depends on whether or not that year zero has guaranteed progression. There is a definition in Annex B, which sets out where year zero courses are considered eligible for inclusion in HESES. And this includes that there is guaranteed progression onto the relevant higher education course upon successful completion of the foundation year. And where that is the case, foundation years are considered an integrated part of the higher education course. And so when the student begins the foundation year, that would meet the criteria for generating a first countable year of instance in HESES for the higher education course. So they would be a new entrant, unless they have already been returned as a new entrant in either of the previous 2 years. So it's worth checking against that. Obviously, the other bit as well is whether or not they are active at the same broad level. So obviously, progressing from a foundation year onto a foundation degree is undergraduate. But if, for instance, a student was progressing from completing a degree onto completing a master's top-up, that would be changing levels. So the student would be considered a new entrant for the master's, where they were progressing onto that, having completed a degree. And that's all the questions we have.
Okay, because you were speaking, Graham, you may not have seen, but I think the person who asked that foundation year question has actually come back and said it's integrated, so guaranteed progression. So that was something that you touched on, wasn't it?
Indeed, yeah, and there was another bit about progressing from a BA to an MA, so covered that one as well.
Yeah, excellent, good. Okay, I think, as you say, that is pretty much all of the questions that we can see at the moment. So we've got a couple more slides to look at, so we'll do that as we start to wrap up. So let's just get back. So as I say, to wrap up, this slide lists the annexes that we've referred to during the presentation. So Annex A and B very much go together. That's the definition of the HESES population and the definition of recognised higher education for funding purposes. And then in terms of the classifications, we looked at mode of study, which is all about Annex D, level of study Annex E, price group in Annex G, and the length of year in Annex H. And most recently, we've been looking at the fundability status and domicile, which is all in Annex F. And the bit on new entrants is in Annex C. So hopefully that will give you a bit of a roadmap to see where to look. So let's see what we've covered today. This is a long session, unfortunately. There's a lot to get through today. So if you have lasted this long, congratulations. As stated then at the beginning of this webinar, what we're aiming to look at today was to just have a brief look at the workbook. A brief look because there's more to be, we've looked at it slightly, but you'll see more of it next time. And then we talked about the HESES population and how it's defined. Most of the session, though, has been on the different categories that we place students into. So we talked about mode, level of study, length of year, price group, fundability status, domicile, new entrants, and we had a brief look as well at multiplication factors, which is new this year. And now I hope you feel that, this has given you some idea about each of these areas. Let me remind you that there will be a recording of the event today on our website on the event page within a day or two, hopefully by the end of the week. And we'll also put the slides that we've been using up there as well. So this is the part where I get to big up next week's events. They will take place on Tuesday and Thursday at the same time, 1:30. So we're going to look at identifying and counting students to be included in HESES24 on Tuesday, how to count students, particularly with regard to HTQs that I've touched on, and the healthcare tables, also mentioned briefly today. And a couple of days later, we are going to discuss how to submit your workbook, what we do in terms of the data verification process, and what that feeds into then is the sign-off process. And then I've been talking about these multiplication factors. So talk a little bit about their derivation. And then if you want to, on how to submit representations on what you have as your multiplication factors. You can still sign up for both of these. You can see the address on the next slide here, officeforstudents.org.uk/events for that. And just to remind you that the kickoff point for all Good Things HESES is officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES. That will get updated as we go through the next few weeks as more and more resources become available. So for example, one of the questions was about the information that goes into the courses table for further education colleges. So that's the place to look at there. If you've got any questions or you have any feedback about what we do during the webinars or just questions generally about HESES, our mailbox is HESES, HESES @officeforstudents.org.uk. So just a last check, I can't see any more questions. So I think that's plenty for today. So thank you all for listening and watching, and we hope that it's been useful for you, and we hope to see you again next week. So take care until then. Bye.